in tonight's lesson, we're going to be looking at different types of geometry to see how it can be used as a compositional tool and help you construct interesting images. Again, like the subjects covered in the last lesson, you can add these to your toolbox of compositional techniques and draw on them when something isn't working or simply when you want to recognize them and when they present themselves. Okay, so the first thing is, why do we want to be learning about composition? Why do we want to learn about this? And we discussed this last week in terms of what do we want to be learning this for? Well, we talked about unclear communication of your vision. And really what that means is that when you have an idea for a shot or you have an idea for an image, that you can actually communicate that the viewer is able to understand that. We also talked about not fully utilizing your creative abilities. And really where that comes from is just this idea about you have all this creative potential, or you may not know about this creative potential. And when we learn technical subjects or technical techniques, we do try and expand on what we see as our creative abilities already. We also talk about an inability to take full advantage of the subject and its potential. So, without these kind of skills, we won't be able to fully take that advantage of a subject and its potential. So when we looked at it last week, we talked about working the subject or making your way around the subject to understand exactly, what is the best that this particular shot can offer, what is the best things that this subject can offer us from a creative point of view or a compositional point of view. So exploring the subject, and without these kind of skills, you just won't really fully utilize what you're looking at. We also talked about developing compositional skills and techniques. So when we looked at different techniques last week, we talked about building that toolbox of skills that you can draw from when things aren't really working. So as I say, you may find yourself in a position or in a situation where you're not quite getting your full, you're not seeing the shot, you're not finding that shot you wanted. And having these compositional skills and techniques, particularly the ones we're going to look at tonight, give you reference points or starting points for finding your shots. So you may go out with a certain way of thinking on a day and use that to identify certain components in a scene that will help you as a starting point to kick off your sort of creative inspiration. And that'll make more sense as we look at different techniques throughout the night. We also talked about expanding that visual awareness, and this is a similar idea. With more of these compositional techniques, your visual awareness will start to grow. So when you have a certain technique in mind, your visual awareness to see these components or see these elements within a shot will grow. So a lot of you guys have already told me in the last 2 days, you're already starting to see things a little bit differently. So you're starting to see, certain compositional rules start to turn up. Like, I hear a lot of you guys have been using the rule of thirds as a starting point for making images, which is fantastic. We're also talking about developing and broadening that compositional vocabulary. And I've seen this in so many of you guys already, which is fantastic. You are telling me what you see in your shots. You're telling me not just from a technical point of view, but also from a compositional point of view. And that's really important because that just broadens everything you know about photography. And that's where we want to be. So the other things that we will learn from this is about critically engaging or analyzing other people's work. So we will have an understanding of somebody else's work when we look at it. So we can say, when we see an image, we can talk about its composition, or we can talk about its technical aspects. And then that will also make us more aware of what we want or what we look for when we actually go out shooting. So it's a fantastic thing to do. And this is just, again, part of an expansion of your overall knowledge and skills as a photographer. You guys are photographers, no matter what level you're at, and you want to build that knowledge base, and that's your skills in that area. That's what we're all here to do, right? Are we all here to develop our skills and build our knowledge and expand on all these things that we're learning? And I think from all of you guys that I talk to, you can find this starting to happen already. And this is really exciting because this is kind of the start of you building on your knowledge that you already have and actually opening up more and more possibilities. So that's what we're all about. So the first thing we're going to be kicking off tonight's lesson with is looking at lines. And lines are one of the most interesting forms to work with, as they can be used to create really strong compositions. Lines can be a lot of fun to work with because you don't always have to be concerned with what the subject of the image is. Rather, create images with interesting geometry and form. Lines can also be a compositional tool to lead the viewer's eye into the frame and back out of it. Lines can be a strong structural man-made form, or it can be soft natural lines found in nature. Lines can simply be created by repeating objects as well. So we will look at this with some examples now in a few minutes. Lines can be used as a compositional tool to draw on when you can't find anything interesting in your subject. Walking around this forest, there wasn't anything particularly interesting to shoot. So I was trying out point of views, I was trying out wide shots, close-up shots, looking for particular trees or trying to find textures and details that were interesting. Nothing was really working. So I decided just to focus on lines to make composition. As the trees were grown in a very linear style and very similar in shape, they were naturally provided geometry to work with. Now, so focusing just on lines provided shots like this. There isn't any real particular subject, rather geometry and shape is the subject. Okay, it's simply an image of repeating lines. So again, as I said, focusing just on lines provided a shot like this. The viewer can still see and understand that the image is a forest, but the entry point to this image is just purely a compositional one. So it's an image of simple repeating lines. It's just in a situation where you don't have a particularly interesting subject, and you simply draw on shape as the main entry point or a main starting point for your image. So again, this is another similar image of just repeating lines that create an interesting form. Of course, the mix of colors help to give the image some dynamics, but really form and angles of the lines is just a nice, simple, visually interesting image. Again, this is a great tool to use to make an otherwise boring or mundane subject a little bit more interesting. So we're not particularly looking at the subject to have a huge amount of meaning. We're simply just taking shapes and lines and geometry as a way to create a visually interesting image that's enjoyed purely for that. Nothing else. It just creates something to really look at and to make interesting. Again, as a standalone subject, maybe an electrical pylon may not be the most interesting subject to photograph, but it's the repeating lines of the structure itself and the cables that have created this strong compositional presence. This is where looking for a compositional feature such as lines will help you make interesting pictures rather than going out looking for a strong subject to shoot. So again, we're just looking at the lines as a compositional form or compositional structure to create another, an interesting image of something that may not be interesting as a standalone subject. Lines can be implied too. So the compositional strength of this image comes from the implied line formed by the row of nails or screws. So you can see by the red line that I've put in here. Again, the subject alone may not be very interesting, but it's the form or geometry of the scene that you can work with to find something to capture. Here's a nice curved line created by shadow and leads the viewer's eye into the scene. It's a very simple composition. Remember that you don't need to get complicated with your images unless there's a reason to. So in this particular image, just seeing the shape in the shadow of the tracks creates a nice leading line that brings the viewer's eye around to the subject, which may be the tree or the sunset itself. But either way, the lines are what draw us in towards the center of that scene. Again, another example of implied lines creating visual interest. So lines don't have to be solid or physical things. They can simply be created by shadow, tone, or even light. In this case, lines are one of the strong compositional elements of this image. But we do have another compositional element going on in this image, and it's pretty much simplicity. It's a very simple image. And a lot of these images are because they don't have a huge amount of components, visual components, and they can be just enjoyed at that level, a level of simplicity, a level of just pure visual interest, nothing else, no meaning, no deep, reading in the image, rather than just a simplistic view or something interesting to quickly look at and move on. If we were to fully dissect these images, we would probably find that there are more than one compositional technique going on. This is all part of developing that visual awareness we've been talking talking about, and broaden the range of compositional techniques as you build your images by combining them. So you guys will start to probably find more than one or two of these compositional techniques or elements going on in your own images. Okay, so the next image we have here is a much more complicated image that is still built on the principle of lines. We have looked at lines as simply creating visual interest in image, but in this image, the use of lines is doing two things. It is the basis for the geometry in the image, as most of the composition is built on strong lines. However, lines are also a secondary device here to draw the viewer's eye around the composition and towards the center of the scene. So we have the strong lines that give us our compositional form, and we also have the lines that are leading our eyes back into the scene towards the what could be argued as the main subject. Here is a much more complicated image, and you can see that, but you can see how lines form two things: the compositional structure and also the leading lines that take us to the subject in terms of, you know, a foundation for building the image, but also as a way to bring the viewer to where you might want to get them. So the next image we have here is, we can see it has, lines are a strong compositional tool, and again, it doesn't necessarily need to be straight or symmetrical to add visual interest and form to your image. Take this image for instance, guys. The lines are all different angles and create a nice, interesting form within the image. But we also have a line in this image that's causing issues. There's a line that's causing a little bit of visual, just visual issues really. It's that branch or vine that's coming in from the left of the shot and exiting to the top left. And here where you can see it, I've just highlighted it here for you. And what is the function of this line? Nothing really, right? Sure, it's like a natural element and it's in the natural environment, but within our composition it's causing issues. It acts as another leading line that takes your eye from the middle of the frame and out to top left. It's a distraction, guys, and it's causing compositional issues. It's also cutting off a portion of the scene by isolating it within that space. So we have this space within our image that's kind of cut off and isolated from the rest of it. So you can see it kind of breaks the composition by dividing up the scene when there's absolutely no reason to do that. Again, this is where really looking at your scene helps. You might not notice this when shooting, but it's probably going to drive you crazy later on when you're looking back at your image and you're going to wish it wasn't there, and you're going to maybe try and fix it in Photoshop and cause yourself a lot of hassle for such a simple issue. So I know I've said this loads during lesson 5, but always look all around that viewfinder when you try and spot issues before they make it into your captured shot. You do need to scan your eye around, because otherwise you're not going to see these things, and they're going to, as I said, drive you crazy later on. So lines in your image don't need to be parallel to each other either, or create a particular shape. As you can see in this close-up of a building, the natural symmetry is lost within the crop. So this is a crop of a building or a monument. However, the image still works because it's based on that construction of lines. When you actually highlight the lines, they don't seem to make any logical sense, but within the image they just work because of that ability for lines to create a form and create shape on their own. So guys, the next image here is about just looking at sometimes how we actually compose image based on the principles of lines without even noticing. So sometimes, and again we talked a little bit about it last week, about some people have a natural ability to, you know, to formalize images, or a natural ability to be creative, and sometimes you don't even notice this thing. So you may go back to your older images and realize they're constructed around strong lines that you just naturally included. So you may have focused on that. Again, you may not just have had the vocabulary to say it, but you may, as I said, go back and dissect your own images and see, actually I used lines as a formal element or as a construction tool for making that particular image. So you can see here, in a particular shot like this, you may not be thinking about it, but those kind of lines, that structure is there. So Shapes can also be a really useful compositional tool within an image. Shapes can be another idea that you fall back on if you're finding it difficult to compose. You could seek out different shapes in your scene and see if it works as a compositional element. So what we talk about, guys, is that at certain points, when you hit that block that we talked about, when you just can't find a shot, you draw on things like shape, you draw on things like lines, and you use them as a starting point to make images. So when you work with shapes, you might work with very literal shapes. You may also work with two or more shapes and combine them to create visual interest. Other times you might work with more subtle shapes or implied shapes, as we'll see in a minute. Okay, so a nice simple use of shape. A big square shot from straight on, but there's also some more squares nested inside that larger shape. This creates a nice formal composition that's built around the compositional element of shape. This shot also includes some nice strong horizontal lines like we just looked at, and as you know, the image is also just very simple. So there's a couple of those different compositional techniques or tools going on in this particular image, like our discussion on simplicity. So we've looked at how you can put all of these compositional tools together and you can combine them and make even a shot that's as simple as this. So there can be a lot of different things. All these elements come together and create a nice, simple, visually interesting image. So we're not talking about creating a very strong image with a lot of impact in terms of what the meaning or the saying is. We're just using it as purely a formal way of creating something that just might be interesting to look at. It might be visual, and it could be just for a viewer to glance at for a second, say, that's a nice image, and move on. In this image, we have some strong circular shapes. The repeating circle shape creates a strong symmetrical composition. Now, in this image, you could possibly have moved around to the front and captured the subject straight on and maybe even emphasized the shapes more. Again, remember to always explore the scene for more compositional possibilities. It's not unusual to return to an image later and see it differently. So again, you probably find this yourselves, guys, at home. When you make images, you come back to them a week later and go, oh, well, if I only had did this and changed that around or moved around a little more, I could have changed it. But getting into the habit of fully exploring your subject will help reduce the amount of time you find yourself rethinking shots. So, by having all of these techniques and having that ability to explore, you will cut down the amount of time you spend rethinking your photography or rethinking your shots. And if there's shots that you can remake, then go back out there. Get back out there and capture them again. It's amazing what fresh eyes can do when you return to a subject. So getting back out is also important, not just thinking, oh, I could have changed that. Actually go and do it. So here we have an example of implied shape. Here we can see the bridge and its reflection creating an almost perfect circle within the image. Shapes can create other shapes with their shadows or their reflections or even just their relationship to other objects. Keep an eye out for shapes that are created by chance. So in this particular scene, the bridge is the prominent subject, but the combination of the bridge and its reflection creates a strong visual element. And what I like about images like this is you could actually look at this image and simply just see and enjoy the bridge within the landscape, but you maybe after a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds of actually looking at it, you discover the shape or the additional shape. Subtle use of certain elements and objects can be a fun way to play with the images, play with the viewer's interpretation of the image, and give the viewer something to find. They may think that they've actually seen and enjoyed the entire shot, and then in a few seconds or a few minutes of viewing the image, discover a little bit more about it. So just start to see these things, to start to discover them, and it creates an interesting way of giving the viewer something to explore within your image. So shapes don't have to be quite so apparent and solid either for them to be effective. Your brain will naturally make the connection between shapes and fill in the blanks for you. So you don't have to be quite so literal with our shapes as well. So don't always feel like you have to have perfectly formed shapes in your image. Give the viewer something to think about and something to figure out and make the connection themselves. In this image, we have two very prominent circles in the shot. The other circle is just implied or hinted at, and you don't need to see the full circle. So you can use your visual awareness to make that connection. So this level of visual awareness is natural in most people, and even if you don't have the compositional vocabulary to express exactly what makes that connection for them, it'll still be made. So we'll still make that connection ourselves between, a full circle and a half circle and feel that kind of relationship, and most of us will have that ability to do that. You can even go a bit further with this image and start to make connections with other implied circles, like on the left and right. Again, we don't have to see the entire shape to know that they're adding compositional value. Now guys, can anyone else see the use of shape or shapes reappearing anywhere else in this scene? The arches, or the three arches in the background. Again, the same thing there. We've got these implied shapes. They're not full circles. They don't exactly make it, but as a visual element, they do connect with the other circles and create a very formalized feel to the composition. And this is all structured around circles or around shapes as a compositional element. Here's just a nice simple example of spotting shapes and using it as a compositional tool to make a nice, simple, visually interesting image. Again, shapes don't have to be perfectly symmetrical. So again, it's just that implied idea of shapes. And this particular image will also come up later on when we talk about repetition. Strong shapes can be found anywhere and don't necessarily have to be, to be seen as for what the subject itself is. We can simply be looking at the shape. In an image like this, you could simply say, oh, it's just a road sign. I see these every day. It's a boring thing to shoot. But it's the strong and pronounced shapes that make the image a strong graphical, they create strong graphical elements and thus create a visual interest in. Again, it's a nice example of two shapes working together to build a composition. So in this image, the two road signs, just create a nice, solid graphical element and, again, two shapes working together. Again, just to keep your eyes peeled for different shapes all around you. And again, like all the compositional tools we've looked at, it's a great mode to switch into when where you just can't find anything interesting. Just stop and say to yourself, what if I focus just purely on shapes around me and see what you come up with? These kind of tools and techniques will definitely help you develop your visual awareness and also help your compositional skills. So, like we've already seen, shapes can just be implied. We're seeing triangles. As I said, they don't have to be perfect shapes to function as a visual or compositional element within your image. They could just be implied or created by objects really by accident, and they help formalize your image and just create a nice symmetry, a nice balance to your images. Okay guys, so repetition. Repetition is just a nice, satisfying compositional element to use in your images. Repetition can be shapes, they can be lines, textures, or any form really. Repetition creates visual structure and order. It's a nice way to make sense of objects in your scene. You can use repetition in many ways. You may actually see the repetition in the subject and be drawn to that, or you might use the camera's position or the subjects in a way to create repetition. So we can naturally find it, or we may actually kind of seek it out or kind of manipulate the scene to create repetition. We'll look at some examples of that now. So here's a great example of natural repetition in a scene. The repeating pattern of the plants creates such a strong formal composition, and a shot that lends itself to be captured this way. Again, there's just something satisfying about the form of this image. There is another composition element that can be created as a result of repetition in the scene. It is exactly that. We're seeing lines, and lines are forming because of this repetition. So you can start to see how you can have more than one of these compositional elements happening within your image. Okay, so here is repetition used in a less uniform way. As a composition, it doesn't make any particular logical or structural sense. It's just purely strong visual repeating patterns. And if the composition does make any sense, it's because the subject is repeated so often. So in this image, the colors are really adding an edge to the pattern and making it more dynamic. So overall, it's really just the subject itself repeating so many times that brings logic back to it. It's not as formalized as the image we've just seen. So don't worry about repetition having to be so formal. It can be very disjointed and very all over the place like this image, but it's the subject repeating itself that creates that sense of repetition. So here's an excellent example of using the camera position and subject placement to create a subtle repetition. So here we have the dancers all in a similar pose, creating this strong repeating form. But the clever camera position and composition, then the composition captures that again in the mirror in the background. So we're seeing it in the mirror in the background as well. So we've got this lovely form of the three dancers, but just moving the camera to the right position gives you another view or repeats that pattern in the mirror again. And that is just clever composition, but it's mainly visual awareness. So do you guys like the way that you can actually manipulate your camera position and find that? And again, this is what we're doing tonight. We're talking about visual awareness and finding these things. And once you understand these things, you're naturally going to find it. So you're going to find yourself looking for repetition and then, seeking it out. And that may mean moving the camera around, may mean getting higher or lower, or just, even moving objects or subjects around till you find it. So again, a lovely use of form to create repetition. In this particular image, the photographer is ignoring the dancers as the main subject and focusing more on the repetition and form created by their bodies. So remember that repetition doesn't have to be 100 repeating objects or shapes. You can create it with just a few and even simple objects. Again, also remember that you can arrange the objects or change camera position to find and create repetitive form yourself. It's very difficult to fault an image like this. It's visually interesting on so many levels, but also we can recognize the main form and the main subject as well. So here's a fantastic use of repetitive form. The repeating shape of the chairs creates such a strong form and presence in the scene. In this case, it's nicely balanced with the main subject in the center. So we can have a repetitive scene that also has a main subject. And this is a particularly good example of that. So repetition doesn't have to be just, the same pattern repeated or same form. It can also have in a main subject. So there still is a main subject in this scene, but the repetitive form adds much more drama to the shot. And what I like about this particular shot is the shape of the lady's hat even complements the repeating shapes of the chair. Do we see how even the shape of the hat kind of follows that formal shape of the chairs and that repetitive pattern? It makes such an interesting image, and it's something, again, the more your own visual skills develop, the more you start to spot these little things. And you could even argue that the straps of the handbag are very similar in shape, and they also, whether it's on purpose or not, they also create that sense of repetitive form. So what we're going to talk about now is part of that idea of repetition. It's called the rule of threes. And this is not the same. It's totally different to the rule of thirds. This is just a simple guideline for creating repetitive pattern or compositions. So when you're composing an image, obviously having one main subject on its own is just the subject on its own. There's no sense of repetition. Two subjects or two objects are really more of a pair and create a sense of balance. But once you go to three, there's a pattern starting to form and repetition starts to form. Naturally, in our own brains and the way we think ourselves, we do think that anything beyond three starts to create a pattern. So that's just a way of thinking that more than three objects form a pattern for us. So if you're trying to create repetitive form, three objects or more will start to generate that sense of repetition in your mind and also in your visual skills. You start to feel like the image is repeating some sort of form or pattern. So just as a guideline, if you're trying to create repetition, anything beyond three really starts to create that sense. So symmetry is another way that we can create interesting images and also use compositional techniques or tools to draw from. So we talked about balance in our images in lesson 5, and we looked at how objects can play off each other in different parts of the scene to create balance with our pictures. One of the easiest ways to achieve balance in your image is to look for symmetry within your compositions. Symmetry is such a strong compositional element that can make images very strong and visually pleasing. The natural logic and order that symmetry creates automatically means your eye knows exactly where to go in a shot. The object or subject that you shoot doesn't have to be perfectly symmetrical in its form. In an image like this, well, in this particular image, the perfect reflection still in the water creates natural symmetry by replicating the landscape and the sky, but reflections and even shadows are fantastic for creating symmetry. In this image, the landscape is almost perfectly replicated by the reflection in the water, but even if it wasn't, even if you just had the outline reflected, or just maybe the shape or the form of the mountains cast maybe as a shadow, these things would also still create a nice sense of symmetry. So it doesn't always have to be as perfect as this. We could simply have the line or a shadow of this mountain. We could also maybe just have a just simply see the form rippling in the water, but it's the natural, we would naturally create the sense of repetition or the logic of repetition ourselves. So it's an interesting way to work with symmetry. The construction and form of objects themselves can create their own symmetry. In this case, the aircraft is perfectly symmetrical in form from left to right in terms of its design and its features. The key to shooting and capturing objects that have their own symmetry is usually to photograph them from straight on or straight on point of view. So in this case, the image is shot looking dead ahead at the aircraft. By doing this, you keep everything the same size within the frame, and you don't break that natural symmetry. If you were to move even around slightly to the left or right, objects on one side would get bigger and objects on the other side would get smaller, so the more we move around the subject, and we totally lose that sense of symmetry. So if something's got a perfect or natural symmetry, shooting from straight on at the right kind of angle, you will create that sense of symmetry. Otherwise, if we start to move around and manipulate the position too much, we will make one side bigger, one side smaller, and lose the natural symmetry. In symmetrical images, you're looking for a sense of equilibrium between objects and shapes. We're just talking about drawing on these things. It doesn't mean every image that you make has to be symmetrical. It just means if you see it, you're aware of it, or if you're having difficulty finding something, maybe it's something you can look for as a starting point to make images. We also have a thing called entry and exit. We use compositional techniques, or when we use them, we're usually trying to create order in our scene and make sense for the viewer. So we want the viewer to make sense for a scene. And we have briefly mentioned how we can guide the viewer's eye through the scene. Compositional elements allow you, or compositional techniques allow you to use these elements within your composition to guide the viewer's eye towards the subject. Geometry is a great tool to use when creating compositions. In this image, the strong lines of the handrail and the walls moving up at that sort of angle bring your view right up from the bottom of the frame to the main subject in the shot. And it's a very simple use of it. We're using lines, but we're using the lines as an entry point, and they bring our view, or they guide our eyes all the way up to the viewer, or to the main subject of the scene. Can we see how that's happening in this image? So do you find that your eye starts at the bottom of the frame and makes its way up to the main subject? And this happens in milliseconds, but this is what the form of these elements are doing. This is what this entry point does for us. It takes our view towards the main subject. Again, the same idea is going on in this shot. It has strong visual geometry, and in this case, it simply leads you in towards the main subject. So we have these very strong shapes and forms, and particularly the angle, the way that it gets narrower, just directs our view right into the main subject. And this is something that we may not consciously know about, or we may not consciously feel, but like last week when we looked all around those images, when we were feeling how our eye is guided around an image, you could probably feel the same here. You can feel, if you think about it for a second or actually be aware of it, you can probably feel your eye move from the bottom of the scene through to the center, and that's what leading lines can do for you. And that creates what we call that entry point that guides you towards the image. Same idea here, but much subtler. What we have here is that particular river at the foreground of the image, how that brings your eye into the scene. It leads you on a little bit of a journey around the shape of it and brings you to that little boat. And from there you can kind of go where you want within the image, but there's an entry point that leads you around the scene and brings you to the subject. And it's a very interesting way of approaching your work. And it's something you'll begin to start to see yourselves. In terms of entry and exit, we also have images where we can be led into the image by a particular object and also led back out. And sometimes this is used to just guide the viewer's eye through the image and back out the other side. So in this image here, we're kind of brought in from the left or right, depending on which way you look at the image, and we're led through the scene and back out the other side. And can you guys feel how that actually happens when you're looking at the image? You can feel yourself move around the object, move around that shape, and actually exit the scene on the other side. Lines and are great for doing that. Lines and shapes can be great for guiding the viewer's eye. And also things like the certain elements within your scene. Commonly used to do this is things like railway tracks, or railway track that leads all the way back out of the scene, or roads, or different things like that. Anything that has a strong structural shape or strong formal lines will take your view into the scene and back out the other side. And that can be used as just a visual trick to get, and as a compositional technique. So we're going to talk about framing. Now, throughout the course, we've talked about anything within the picture as being the frame. So anything within the rectangular shape of your actual image, we call the frame. And when we're composing images, you usually talk about framing the shot. However, you can also have framing within your images too. So almost like frames within the frame. Frames within images are a great way, again, of defining your subject and directing the viewer's eye towards the subject. This will make sense when we have a look at some examples. But just remember that when we talk about the frame itself, it's usually anything that's inside the boundaries of the image, but we can also have frames within our images. So here we have a classic use of frames within frames. Here we have the main frame, which is the boundaries of the image. Okay, and I've highlighted there for you guys with some red arrows. But we also have this frame created by the car window. This frame creates a solid form around the subject and helps guide your eye directly to the main subject. Frames can have a very strong presence in an image, and if used correctly, have a lot of visual interest. So can you see how framing can really guide you towards the main subject? And it also makes the image a little bit more visually interesting. So it creates a couple of different elements within your image. Frames can be found anywhere. Like all of the compositional techniques we've looked at so far, all you have to do is be aware of them and you'll start to see them everywhere. Then it's up to you whether you use them or not use them in your shot. As long as you're aware of them, you can draw from them and you can actually incorporate them into your photography. But if you don't like them as a compositional element, you don't have to use them. Here we have natural frames created by the trees, and this creates a strong form, again, around the subject, which draws your eyes straight towards the subject. Look around when you're composing your images and see if there are frames that can be used in your shots. Getting creative with your framing and finding objects and forms within your environment to make frames from as well. So look for creative ways of using framing. In this shot, the car mirror is used as a compositional tool to frame the subject and create a very strong visual image. Again, anything with strong form and shape can be used to frame the subject. Would you agree, guys, it's a very interesting use of framing? Very simple if you're to think about it at the time. And you can use loads of things, guys. You can use maybe doorways, you can use archways, you can use trees. It can be anything at all, as long as it's creating a frame or a shape around the subject and doing following its purpose, which is really to guide the viewer's eye in towards the subject. And that's usually the way it's used. In this image, it's particularly creative because it is also actually showing you some other subjects that are outside of the frame, which is another interesting use of it, and that's a really creative use of it. But certainly be aware of how framing can be used. And frames, as I said, can just be simply to emphasize the subject and also create more visual interest, and it's a fantastic way of using it. The other thing we're going to talk about tonight, guys, is visual consistency. And as a term, or as like what we talk about our compositional vocabulary, you may not have heard this term before, but it's something we probably all notice when we look at images. Visual consistency just refers to having structure to your composition, or some element within your image that ties a number of images together. The first reason you may want to do this is to simply create the link between the images and make sure that the viewer understands that they're related. So the other reason you may want to do this, to create visual consistency in your images is just to create an easy way to identify a set or a series of images and not to cause any visual confusion to the viewer when they're looking at them. So we're really using them to tie a set of images together so that they're strong when they work as a set, and also so that they can be linked together by the viewer, so the viewer understands they're part of a set. And what I mean by this is that when the viewer looks at the work, they can naturally move from one image to the other without seeing problems in the composition or the way that the images are presented. We will see this in our next example. So here we have a set of 4 portraits. They may be presented this way, like in a single frame, or be side by side on a wall, or part of a set maybe in a book or an album. Whatever way they're presented, as they are right now, they're not consistent and difficult to look at as a set. The first image is a half-length portrait, and as a standalone image, it's a nice composition, nice shot. The second image, again, is a nice head and shoulders shot on its own. However, the girl is much larger in the frame. She's also much lower down in the frame and doesn't really sit well beside the shot to the left of her. Just by putting these 2 images side by side, there's a feeling that there's something wrong. Again, you wouldn't see this if both were presented singly, and you would actually probably enjoy them both as single shots. However, it's when you see them together you start to see the issue. Image 3 is another head and shoulders type shot, but because this guy is much higher in the frame, it feels much different than the head and shoulders shot to the left of him. Even though they are not that much different in terms of pose and size within the frame. Again, this guy on his own would make a great shot. It's just when placed with the other images, a bit of confusion and a visual confusion starts to happen. Image 4 is a 3/4 length portrait. Again, not a bad shot on its own. It's a nice pose, a nice expression. She could possibly be centered up in the frame. However, it's not uncommon to move someone off center for visual interest. But again, because she's placed within this group or with the rest of these shots, that she looks small and out of proportion. They do not work as a set. And this is common enough, guys, especially, in people's homes where they've bought frames with multiple pictures and they've just kind of stuck them all together. They've stuck random images together and they just look kind of, they don't look consistent together. We'll have a look at a more consistent layout for these images in the next example. Now, guys, isn't this much better in terms of visual consistency? Your eye can flow across each image without feeling that there's a sense there's something wrong. Each person is pretty much the same size in the frame. They have the same space above their heads, or at least close enough to formalize the set, and they're all roughly similar in half-length portraits. This is not as simple as it seems. You need to have good visual awareness when shooting, particularly when you're creating sets of images. So if you're doing these shoots individually at different times, you would have to keep in mind maybe your camera position, the framing, the pose, and maybe the size of the subject within a frame. These are all considerations you would have to make if you were creating these images independently, maybe on different days. Now, if you did one shoot and had all tight headshots of one of the people, then this wouldn't work as a layout. You wouldn't be able to create that layout. So the best thing to do when you're creating a series is think about it in advance and plan ahead the shoot. You could do one shoot and reference that one image for every shoot afterwards. So you could create one of these images first and use that as a guideline or as a reference point for every image you make after. You could even have the first shoot printed out, or maybe on your laptop or phone the next time you make the composition. So the next time you go out shooting, have the last image that you made with you, so you can compare compositions and you'll know that you're going to get it right before you get back and put them all together and see that something isn't working. The key thing to remember, guys, is consistency makes for a much stronger visual set or series, and it's a lot easier to view. So just bear this in mind anytime whether you're creating images or whether you're trying to put a series of existing images together. Remember, visual consistency will make your set stronger and make it it will up the quality of your photography. So guys, we have looked at a lot of compositional tools and techniques over the last 2 lessons. It's now time to put these into practice. It may be that you only pick one and go out and explore it, or you may make a list and actually try and capture an image illustrating each style. You may try to combine one or more of these elements, Whatever way you decide to do it, it's crucial that you practice, guys. It's crucial that you go out and see these particular elements and look for them and then try and capture them. And again, these are all techniques that are going to pay off so much in terms of resolving creative blocks, getting you out of tricky situations, and just helping you expand that creative ability or creative potential. They will also really enhance your visual awareness, and you'll find yourself noticing and paying much more attention to the form and shape of objects in the world around you. And this will just open up infinite photo opportunities and possibilities. We do find after this class, we get so many emails and so many messages back in from people saying that they're seeing things a lot differently. And even on your walk to work, you don't even have to have the camera with you. You could be just out and about, even in the room around you. Start to think about all of these different elements that we've looked at tonight. You will probably find yourself looking at shapes, looking at form, looking for repetition, and it doesn't have to be while the camera's in front of you. Use these techniques as a way of just seeing the world around you, and you'll start to see and notice things that you've never noticed before.